We're so happy, the ears up here with me, to introduce our teacher this morning, Michael Kieval. We'll be giving the Dvar Torah, and I want to read his little bio and then a personal note. Michael has been a Bethel member for more than 15 years, lives here with his wife Carla, daughters Isabel and Leslie. His day job is a financial services regulatory attorney. You have 4 words in your title. Financial services regulatory attorney. Michael studied classics at Washington University in St. Louis, graduating with little Latin and less Greek, he said the saying goes, and still enjoys delving into ancient texts. So if you know Michael, you know that he's the kind of person who really goes above and beyond in whatever he does. So not only leading and reading and teaching on Shabbat morning, but always one of our teachers for Tikkun Leil Shavuot, and really always someone who can be relied upon to bring a lot of depth, a lot of knowledge, a lot of wisdom to really everything he does. So I really we all are looking forward to hearing from you this morning.
But no pressure. Thank you, Rabbi. Shabbat Shalom. Birshut HaRabbanim, and thinking today in memory of my grandmother. It's her 31st yahrzeit, Batya, Bat Yechiel Michal, who was known somewhat jokingly as Reb Betty, so with her permission as well. The Parsha this week is Va'et Hanan, the second Parsha of Sefer Devarim, the book of Deuteronomy. And the book of does anyone know what Deuteronomy means? Shout it out. Second law, right? Deftera namion, second law from Greek. In Hebrew, we also call it Mishneh Torah, right? The repetition of the Torah. Our tradition teaches that this book is the only book of the Torah that Moshe authored rather than merely scribing. And as an aside, and to Ben's point earlier, it's the only book that we interpret by looking at what things are next to. So in Sefer Devarim, we can say, oh, this is next to this, and therefore that means something because Moses had a reason rather than we can't know God's reasons for putting things in the order, often out of order, in the other books. In 2 Kings, chapter 22, verse 8, the high priest Hilkiah found a scroll in the temple. Our sages have various interpretations of this, including that this was the missing scroll found was the one that they had the Torah, but this was the Torah written in Moses' own hand. You can imagine that it is more complete from the way the story, because it's related in the context of Josiah Yoshiahu's reforms. And so a number of scholars believe that this newly found scroll was either part or all of our Sefer Devarim. And so it's not just in that sense, it's not just a repetition of the law, but it's one that wasn't necessarily maintained alongside the other parts previously, right? There's something about finding it. Va'et Hanan contains, as we read this morning, the second instance of the 10 Commandments, 10 utterances, the Aseret Dibrot. The first contemporaneous one is in Parshat Yitro, in Shemot or Exodus. And now in our Parsha, Moshe repeats the 10 Commandments for the generation that was born in the desert who will enter the land. And there are some differences. You can see, in fact, in the Chumash at the page that the rabbi pointed to earlier, that 15-something, 11 maybe, they show them side by side, and you can see the differences. And I'd like to focus briefly, before we get into more topics, on 2 of the more significant differences. First, in the 4th commandment of Shabbat that I stumbled through as I was reading this morning, there are a number of differences, including the famous Zachor Shamor distinction. We're commanded to Zachor, commemorate, which is remembering but out loud. That's how we understand Zachor. Or here we read Shamor, guard or keep. So which one is it? Both, right? Because what? What do we say? Exactly. Shamor v'zachor b'dibur echad. That God, that we could only write one in each place. A human being could only say one, but at Sinai, God said both words simultaneously. And therefore that these both words were connected there. And so in the second telling, the second recounting of the 10 Commandments, we get this other piece, this shamor. There are other explanations as well of the distinction and why, but this idea that, and this teaches us different things, right? The positive commandments of Shabbat that we commemorate affirmatively, and the shamor, the negative commandments of Shabbat, the things that we guard Shabbat against. Our sages, and so in that sense, we need both, right? Both gives us a much fuller understanding of the truth of the Torah than we would have with only one. And if you look, I think, does everyone have source sheets? You can see. There's other differences too. Does someone want to read in the English the version from Exodus? Don't all start at once.
Remember the Sabbath day and keep it holy. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work, but the seventh day is the Sabbath of the eternal your God. You shall not do any work. You, your son or daughter, your male or female slave, or your cattle, or the stranger who is within your settlements. For in 6 days God made heaven and earth and sea, and all that is in them, and then rested on the seventh day. Therefore God blessed the Sabbath day and hallowed it.
Okay. And Karen, do you want to read the version from Deuteronomy?
Sure. Observe the Sabbath day and keep it holy, as the eternal your God has commanded you. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work, but the seventh day is the Sabbath of the eternal your God. You shall not do any work. You, your son, your daughter, your male or female slave, you, your ox or your donkey, or any of your cattle or the stranger in your settlements, so that your male and female slave may rest as you do. Remember that you were a slave in the land of Egypt. And the eternal God freed you from there with a mighty hand and an outstretched arm. Therefore, the eternal your God has commanded you to observe the Sabbath day.
Right, and that observe the Sabbath day, it says la'asot et yom HaShabbat, to make or do Shabbat. There's some differences. What are, other than the Shamor Zachor distinction, what are we struck by?
The slaves.
Right, much more focused, because they're in the first one, but they're much more emphasized in the second one. And so what does that tell us? What's the different tone in the second?
Well, it says, remember you were a slave, so you know what it's like to be treated poorly. You shouldn't do that.
Right, it's a clarification. And I don't think there's really inconsistency between these, but we learn some more. We say this is important for everybody. Shabbat is a universal thing within your communities, and it's not just you do Shabbat and forget everybody else. Focus on your animals. Don't let them, don't work them. Okay, yeah.
The other difference between the two, I thought, is time.
Mm-hmm.
Exodus is the story of us leaving, but now we're in the after, and so they're looking back at what they were slaves.
Absolutely. So Adam says that the difference here is also the difference of time, the perspective. The reason, I guess, for the differences is that we're looking back at the fact that they had been slaves, which is in the past. This is already the previous generation had been slaves, and are looking ahead to moving into the land. And these are answers that our tradition gives. So let's now consider the 10th commandment, not to covet. Who wants to read the version from Exodus? Go ahead.
Do not covet your neighbor's house. You shall not covet your neighbor's wife, or male or female slave, or ox or donkey, or anything that is your neighbor's.
All right, right. And you can see I bolded for you. In the Hebrew, it says lo tachmod and then lo tachmod. This is a commandment. Most of the 10 commandments in the text don't have breaks in the middle of what we count. This one in both versions has a closed break in the middle. And in the version in Shemot, it says lo tachmod, you shall not covet, you shall not covet. All right, you want to go ahead and read the Devarim one?
You shall not covet your neighbor's wife, and you shall not crave your neighbor's house, or field, or male or female slave, or ox or donkey, or anything that is your neighbor's.
Right, and so here we see lo tachmod, eshet re'echa, you should not covet, same, your neighbor's wife. Velo titaveh beit re'echa, sadehu, avdo, avto, right, all these other things. You shall not have a craving, it's a different kind of desire. And so the second version, right, adds this new term, lo titaveh. And a number of our sages, including the Rambam, learn that we have two separate commandments as a result. The first time we got the Ten Commandments, we had not to covet, and so from the Sefer HaMitzvot, he says, he prohibited us from putting our thoughts to fabricating machinations in order to acquire that which is in the possession of our brothers. And that is his saying, you shall not covet your neighbor's house. That's from the Exodus version. And the language of the Mechilta is you shall not covet, perhaps even if one covets with speech. Hence, we learn to say you shall not covet the gold and silver. That's later in Dvarim. Just as there, you're not liable until you perform an act, so too here, you're not liable until you perform an act. Behold, it is made clear to you that this negative commandment prohibits us from tricks that enable us to take our brother's property that we have been coveting for ourselves, even when we buy and give him money. You're not allowed to nag him. You're not allowed to, figure out how to maneuver in order how to lawfully obtain something that's someone else's. And now, who wants to read? No, we already read the version from Devarim. So the second one from Devarim, he prohibited us from putting our thoughts to coveting that which is our brother's and to desire it, for this is the entranceway to fabricating machinations, right? It's not the machinations themselves, but it's this entranceway in order to acquire it. And the language of the prohibition about this content is his saying, you shall not desire your neighbor's house, you shall not lo titaveh. And these two negative commandments are not about the same content. Rather, the first negative commandment, you shall not covet, is prohibiting the acquisition of what's someone else's, whereas the second negative commandment prohibits even only to desire it in our hearts, and there's discussion over what triggers that, right? It's not just having a thought of, oh, I'd like that, but you start thinking, you start planning. And the concern is, with this second version, is that if you don't succeed in convincing the person to part with what you really want, I really want that guy's house, I really want, whatever it is, lawfully, then you may end up coming to steal it. And so these are things that are creating more of a healthy society. And so I'd like to put the Ten Commandments aside for a moment and explore this theme further, this idea of retelling something with an added meaning coming from the retelling. Starting with a midrash recounted in the Babylonian Talmud, Masechet Pesachim. And the midrash arises in a discussion about the fact that the Jewish people are dispersed. And to provide some additional context, let's start a little earlier in the text, a brief statement from Rabbi Elazar. Does someone want to read that short text that you have? Go ahead, Craig.
Rabbi Elazar said, "The Holy One, blessed be He, exiled Israel among the nations, so that converts would join them. Only so that converts would join them. As it is stated, I will sow first me in the land. Does a person sow a se'ah, a grain, for any reason other than to bring in several core of grain during the harvest? So too the exile is to enable converts from the nations to join the Jewish people."
Right, so we have this, before we get into the midrash I want to focus on, we have this idea that one of the benefits or one of the blessings of being dispersed all over the world is the idea that we're sown like grain, and that where we're planted, more Jews and more Torah come forth, and that this comes, in this case, through conversion, and that people come to Torah through our being there. And now we get to the midrash I want to focus on, which plays on a verse from the Song of Deborah, which in Judges, which includes the word pirzono from the root peresh zayin, generally refers to something involving the countryside, rustic people, unwalled cities in the book of Esther, Areha Prazot. And the Midrash reads the word, I think plausibly, as being related to scattered, Pei Zayin Resh. Who wants to read our first source? And I'll tell you where to stop.
Rabbi Oshaya said, "What is the meaning of that which is written? The righteous acts of his rulers, is the Torah of Israel. The Holy One, blessed be He, performed a cherubim deed toward Israel, that he scattered
And so I'll pause you here. This is the story that I want us to focus on, right? We have Rabbi Oshia who's giving the context, and he's recounting this story about Rabbi Hanina, and we're going to compare this story to another story. Please go ahead.
A certain apostate said to Rabbi Hanina, "We Gentiles are superior to you Jews in that we have patience. It is written for Joab and all Israel remained there 6 months until he had cut off every male in Edom. Whereas we, although you have been with us for several years, are not doing anything to you." He said to him, "With your consent, let the student deal with your assertions and answer you."
So now we have Rabbi Hanina saying, "Hey, someone else is going to answer you." And who is it? It turns out to be Rabbi Oshia. Go ahead.
Rabbi Oshia dealt with his assertion and said to him, "This is not a sign of your righteousness, but is simply because you do not know how to do it, to destroy us. If you seek to destroy all the Jewish people, you cannot because they are not all with you in your kingdom. If you destroy only those Jews who are with you in your kingdom, you will be called the seventh kingdom for murdering one of its own population." The apostate said to him, "I swear by God of the Romans, with this problem we lie down and with this problem we rise up, for we are constantly struggling with the dilemma of how to eliminate the Jewish people."
Okay. So we have this conversation, and who's involved in the conversation, the underlying conversation? Who are the parties? Right. So we have an apostate. Hahumina, that apostate, generally refers to to various types of breakaway sects. In here, it's probably an early Christian. And he says to whom? Right, to Rabbi Hanina. And he cites this verse. And he says, look, you guys don't criticize us because we're merciful, right? There's this idea in Roman thought and in Roman law of clementia, this idea of not destroying the people that you have subdued. And part of it is showing how powerful you are, right? Showing how powerful you are because you don't need to. They just have to now follow you and obey you. But they also use it to point to as an example of how civilized and how good they are. And it's part of this idea of the Pax Romana. And we have this discussion about that, and the accusation. The accusation is, hey, you would have killed you by now, right? Because we have this previous verse that talks about how Yoav in 1 Kings, it talks about how Yoav had remained there 6 months, which the verse continues until he'd cut the head off every male in Edom. Edom is linked to Rome and Christianity in rabbinic literature. And the response doesn't come from Rabbi Hanina, right? He has someone else respond. Maybe there's a reason. Rabbi Oshia says, well, it's not that you are so kind. You recognize your own limitations. You would you would get all the harm from doing it. Everyone would criticize you, but you wouldn't succeed because we're in a whole bunch of kingdoms, and God has spread us out, and therefore that's another blessing of being dispersed. Now let's read the version from Tana Devi Eliyahu, from Seder Eliyahu Rabbah, a later midrashic source, edited in the 10th century of the Common Era. Many believe in Italy. Note that doesn't mean that the differences are due to it being later. The fact that this compilation is edited significantly later doesn't mean that the source material it's using is later. It could be different versions of the same. Who wants to read the Eliyahu Rabbah version? Go ahead, Mitchell.
It happened that a certain priest and Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi were eating and drinking together. When their hearts were merry, that priest said to Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi, "We are more merciful than you. When you were given permission to cut us off, destroy us, you left over among them only the women. As it is stated, for 6 months did Yoav remain there
Keep going.
Rabbi Yehuda stood up, went to the marketplace, transmitted these words to his students, and then returned and sat in his place. Rabbi Yehuda said to the priest, "If it pleases you, let one of my students enter and tell us something that will bring us joy." The priest said to him, "Let him enter." That student entered, stood on his feet, and said, "The master of the house knows in which place he deposits his vessels. And when the master of the house comes to his home, he will bring his vessels with him into the house."
Okay, so that this word, it's Bal Habayit hu yodea be'eze makom yafkid kelav uksheyavo Bal Habayit leveto yavi kelav imo letoch habayit. This verse is central in this midrash. We didn't see it in the previous version. Keep going.
He said to this thing and repeated it a second and third time until that priest grasped the essence of the matter. Immediately the priest stood up, raised both his hands to heaven, and said, "Blessed is the omnipresent, blessed is he who chose you, Israel, more than all who come into the world, and more than all the handiwork he created in the world. He acquired you as a complete acquisition, called you sons and servants to his names, and called you a people, a heritage, and a treasure to his name. He scattered you in hundreds of places, for we thought, if we kill those who are in the land of Israel, who will kill those in the north and in the south? If we kill those in the north and the south, who will kill those in Babylon? And behold, these matters are nullified on their own, coming to nothing. Certainly the master of the house knows in which place he deposited his vessels, and when the master of the house comes into his house, he will bring his vessels into the house."
Okay, so there's a lot of differences in this story. It's the same structure, the same reading in the verse, the same type of discussion. But what's different? Who wants to identify the differences? Call them out. We don't have a heretic. What do we have? A priest. Right. Now this priest, Comer, is allegedly speaking with whom? Right, Rabbi Yehuda Nasi. So Rabbi Hanina is a first-generation Amora of the land of Israel. Rabbi Yehuda Nasi is like a fifth-generation Tana, and the primary editor of the Mishnah. He's earlier by quite a bit. So we have the story moving back in time. We have a real question of, certainly it's identified with Rome one or the way or the other, but what kind of priest this is and would have been in the era of Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi. Is this a pagan priest or not? What else? What's the differences?
In the first, it identifies the idea that we are favored because we were dispersed. In the second, it identifies a second aspect of that not only were we favored as dispersed, but you're actually a guest in our world. We are not sort of treading on your soil. That we allow you to exist because we are God's chosen people.
So this is very interesting, and I'll repeat for those, for everyone to hear, including those elsewhere, that this idea that the message is much more limited in the version in the Talmud that says, okay, we're blessed because we're dispersed, and it has a good practical importance. And then, of course, the heretic says, you're right. We cannot solve this problem. We've been trying to, but we can't. As opposed to in the second version, we have first of all we have the acknowledgement at the end of Israel's chosenness. We have the acknowledgement of this issue, but also what you had described as being the idea that we belong, that it's our place, that we belong in the world because God put us in these places. But I think also we have a forward-looking piece, right? The version in the Talmud doesn't say what's going to happen later. It's a very practical discussion. But this verse that we have, that says, right, the master of the house knows in what place he deposits his tools, right? You might think that these tools are strewn everywhere, right? You go to the house of a master craftsman, and his stuff is all over the place, on the floor, in the yard, down the street. But he knows where everything in his workshop, everything is, he knows. and you can't take it and think he won't come looking for it. And now we have this message of hope that looks forward, right? We have this idea, a nice theme, I think, for Shabbat Nachamu, that there is this next step of redemption. And God is going to gather us up, seemingly discarded. You think they're discarded, but they're exactly where they should be. Gather us up and bring us back into the house, right? To the land of Israel, to his embrace, to the temple, to whatever it is. And then the response of the priest seems to acknowledge this much more, right? He really, the priest doesn't switch sides. He's not happy about this, but he acknowledges it. Not just that it's correct as a practical matter, but he, sort of praises God's work. Any other interesting or important differences?
This may be completely beside the point, but what struck me is the relationship. They're eating and drinking together. They're friends. They have a relationship. This sounds like it's a part of a sort of ongoing discussion about differences between them, and that they are constantly having these kinds of back and forth.
It's interesting. It's in the context of a social interaction, but one that's fraught. Because what happened, in both of the stories, we see that the first person doesn't respond. He has somebody else respond. Any ideas on why?
The understanding of the role that the Jews play in the world and the specificity within which God has placed us is universally understood by all Jews. So you can ask the question to one person, but any other Jew can answer that response.
So this is a great answer, the idea that this knowledge and this faith in our purpose and in the fact that we will be ingathered is common to all Jews, and therefore you could ask anybody, even a student, anyone could, in this case a very distinguished student, but any student could answer this. At least in the first version, we know it's a distinguished student. Any other thoughts on why maybe in one version or the other, why someone isn't, why is the answer from someone else? Chazan?
Because if the first person answers, they may be in a state of emotional shock of being insulted. They may be too emotionally affected by the conversation to answer right away. We all know that it's better to have an argument about something which is dispassionate rather than filled with emotion. Go to a second person controls your ability to have a effective debate or conversation, and it also shows humility. So the rabbi, it says that he's silent, which is interesting because it sort of parallels Aharon when he learns of his son's death by Yom Aharon. He was silent. Moses falling on his face in Korach's rebellion. So the idea is the reaction. The first reaction is humility, and the second one is let somebody else speak the truth while I'm silent.
Right here it says Shatak Rabbi Yehuda v'lo amar la komer shum davar. He was silent. He didn't say anything back to the priest. He stood up. V'amad Rabbi Yehuda v'alach lashuk umasar hadvarim halalu letamidav v'chazar. And he explained what had just happened to his students in the marketplace, and then came back. So I think we have two very different situations the way it's told. We have the example in the Talmud. It may just be that there was someone else there who had an answer, and the first person deferred. It also can be that these things can be a trap, right? Disputations are really difficult in our history, and that we're not free to answer them any way we want. And so having somebody else answer, either by saying, is it okay if a student answers? In the second version, it's even less than that. We don't know whether Rabbi Yehuda knows what the answer will be. He may have given them the problem to buy time, right? He's been eating and drinking. Maybe he doesn't trust himself. Maybe he wants to keep the sort of, he has to respond, because it's a very it's a fraught and aggressive statement, but one made with a smile in a social engagement. And so how to respond to this when there is a political power dynamic in the land is difficult. And so he may be buying time. He may also be, he doesn't say they're going to respond to you. He says, hey, apropos nothing at all, we might be amused if one of the students comes and shares something, an interesting riddle that we can think about, right? It was something to think about. It was this social context of saying, something that will please us, something that will let us use our minds, maybe. But of course, it's also directly tied. It's directly tied here. Okay. So then, is our dispersion a blessing? Right, it has a practical benefit. It's hard to get rid of all of us, the dispersion. Right, if you have a minority within a single authority, you have this tendency to either assimilate or at some point to simply be destroyed. So the dispersion has that practical benefit. But what's the assumption behind dispersion being a benefit? That what? That if we're not dispersed, what?
You're vulnerable.
Well, vulnerable why? What's the factual scenario?
Well, if you're all on the same plane and the plane goes down, you all die if you're all in different planes.
So right, so this is one Donna says, it's like spreading people out. I heard that years ago. I read that the sumo wrestlers, as a national treasure of Japan, they don't fly all on one plane because if something should happen to that one plane, there would be no more sumo. I don't think so. I don't think so. But the you split it up this way, right? You have the story of Yaakov Avinu who splits his family into separate camps before he meets his brother. Right? We have that, but there's another, and I think that's one valid way of looking at it. We have another way of looking at it. What's the scenario? What is the factual scenario? Because if we were all in one place, what specifically would be able to happen? Right, genocide by the ruler of that place. That we would be subject to being killed by, if we were all in the Roman Empire, which was big, right? Or we were all in any particular empire, then there's just too much to be able to do that. And so, does this mean we don't want to be ingathered? Like the second midrash specifically looks at both scenarios, right? First, we're all spread out, and that's good. And then when God returns to Zion, we'll all be gathered together, and that will be good. Avi, yeah.
With dispersion, we no longer are a human problem to solve, so that it can't be decided as a single king or a single kingdom to solve the problem of a minority identity that is in conflict with the kingdom. So dispersion keeps it in the realm of the divine, that the answer for the Jewish question that is faced by minority population in all the scattered kingdoms keeps it within the divine. And then the hope for the ingathering, or the desire for the ingathering, alludes to the solution being a divine solution. That the problem which is in the realm of the divine because it's so complex, because we are everywhere in little bits and pieces, that becomes resolved with the hand of the divine.
So this is a very astute observation that the dispersion, Avi says that our dispersion means that there is no human has the ability to to eliminate the Jews everywhere, and that the Midrash talks about a divine solution of being ingathered, at which point it highlights the idea that our ingathering is a divine solution. And I would suggest that perhaps there's a middle ground in that analysis as well. And we don't necessarily need to read the particular source in the Rav Soloveitchik's work, Kol Dodi Dofek, his explanation of the religious importance of the otherwise largely secular Zionist movement. But overall within that work, he talks about a theological benefit that I think is similar to what we're dealing with, which is the theological benefit of, people seeing, when we started to ingather, right? Not all of us, but started to ingather in Israel, that the nations see that we're not rejected, that God hasn't decided not to gather us, that we're not replaced or supplanted, and that it flips. We're not so used to the idea of our neighbors thinking that we're that they are the new us. That was much more common 50, 60, 70, 80 years ago. But this idea that there is a spiritual value maybe in these types of disputations of saying, well, look, after all this time, we've come back, we've been successful, we're back in our land, at least proportionately, probably proportionately more than in the end of the Second Temple period. And so I don't think there's a resolution of these pieces, but I think we should. I would ask you. I'll wrap up. I'd ask you to look and think about when we say something again, when we retell something, what else do we get out of it? And is our dispersion a blessing? And what does that mean if it is? Shabbat Shalom.